The night Harriet Reed found out the man she had been falling in love with had been lying to her. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply walked into the middle of the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, and told Monroe Dawson that she would give him exactly one chance to explain himself before she packed her bags and took the morning stage north and never looked back. Monroe Dawson stood in that street with his hat in his hands, the amber light from the saloon windows spilling across his jaw, the Kansas wind cutting through the space between them like a blade, and he looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that had undone her from the very first moment she had walked into this town, and he said he would need the whole evening. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of moment that could either end everything or begin it properly, and then she said, "Fine," and she stayed. But before any of that could happen, before that street and that evening and that long reckoning between two people who had each been carrying too much alone for too many years, there was everything that came before it. And that story deserved to be told from the very beginning, because nothing about Harriet Reed and Monroe Dawson was simple, and nothing between them had ever been easy, and that was precisely why it meant everything. Harriet Reed had come to Caldwell, Kansas, in the late summer of 1878 because she had nowhere else to go. That was the plain truth of it, though she would not have said it so plainly to anyone who asked, because Harriet was not a woman who leaned into her own misfortunes. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a seamstress mother, both of whom had died within 6 months of each other back in Missouri, taken by a fever that swept through their small town the way such things did in those years, without apology and without mercy. She had a modest inheritance that amounted to less than it sounded when said aloud, a trunk full of books, a talent for teaching that her father had passed down to her like a piece of good furniture, and a letter from the town of Caldwell informing her that their schoolhouse had been without a proper teacher for 2 full terms, and that the position was hers if she wanted it. She had wanted it because wanting it meant having a direction, and a direction meant moving forward rather than standing still in the house where her parents had died, and standing still was something Harriet Reed had never been able to do gracefully. So she had packed her trunk, kissed the doorframe of her childhood home, and taken the stage south into Kansas, arriving in Caldwell on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun was still vicious, and the dust rose from every footstep like the town itself was breathing. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town, which meant it was rough around the edges and loud through the center and smelled of livestock and leather, and would smoke and occasionally gunpowder when tempers ran high along the cattle trail. It sat right at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, just north of Indian Territory, and the drovers who brought the longhorns up from Texas came through in great noisy waves that transformed the town from a quiet settlement into something considerably more chaotic for weeks at a time. It had a main street with a general store, a land office, a livery stable, 2 saloons, a barber, a small hotel called the Comstock House, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, and now, thanks to the enthusiasm of its town council, a proper schoolhouse built of plank wood on the north end of town. The schoolhouse was what had brought Harriet Reed, and the schoolhouse was where she went first, before she even checked into the Comstock House, because she wanted to see what she had gotten herself into. It was a single room with 8 benches, a wood stove in the corner, a chalkboard that was newer than everything else in the building, and windows that let in a fine cross breeze when both were open. It smelled of fresh-cut pine and chalk dust, and the particular hope that new construction carries in a young town. Harriet stood in the middle of it with her traveling coat still on, and her hair coming loose from its pins after 2 days in a stage, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been tight and locked since the funeral's loosening slightly. She could work with this. She could do something good here. She had turned to leave and nearly walked directly into Monroe Dawson. He had been standing in the doorway, which in hindsight she would realize was a habit of his, standing in doorways as though he was not quite sure whether to enter or retreat, leaning against the frame with one thumb hooked in his belt and his hat low over his forehead. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had spent years doing physical work, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried several days of dark stubble. And he had brown eyes that looked at her with a calm directness that she found simultaneously comforting and unsettling. He stepped back quickly when she nearly ran into him, catching her by the elbow so she did not stumble over the threshold, and he said, "Pardon me, ma'am," in a voice that was low and unhurried, and she said, "Pardon me." And then they both stood there for a moment in the doorway of the schoolhouse while the late afternoon sun beat down on the plains behind him. He introduced himself as Monroe Dawson and said he had been asked by the town council to make sure the schoolhouse was in proper shape before the new teacher arrived, as he had done some of the carpentry work on the building. He said he had not expected her to arrive quite so soon. She introduced herself as Harriet Reed and said she had not expected to nearly walk into anyone, and he smiled at that just slightly, and it changed the whole geography of his face in a way that she found herself cataloging and storing away before she had even made a conscious decision to do so. He asked if the building met her expectations. She told him honestly that it exceeded them. He looked genuinely pleased by that, the kind of please that comes from a craftsman hearing that his work has been appreciated. And he told her that if she found anything that needed adjusting or fixing, she should send word to the livery stable on the south end of Main Street and ask for him there. She said she would and thanked him, and he tipped his hat and walked back down the dirt path toward Main Street, and Harriet Reed watched him go for precisely 3 seconds longer than she needed to before she collected herself and went to check into the Comstock house. She found out later, through the efficient information network that exists in every small town, that Monroe Dawson was 31 years old, that he was a carpenter and ranch hand who had been in Caldwell for 2 years, that he was known as a reliable worker and a quiet man, and that he was, according to the proprietress of the Comstock house, a Mrs. Nora Tillies, who seemed to know everything worth knowing about everyone in town, a perfectly decent man who kept to himself more than most. Harriet noted all of this and told herself it was simply useful information about a person she had met and would likely encounter again in a town this size, and then she went to sleep and dreamed of nothing in particular. The weeks that followed were full and demanding in the best possible way. The school opened on a Monday morning with 14 students ranging from age 6 to age 15, children of ranchers and shopkeepers, and the occasional drifter who had decided to put down roots in this stretch of Kansas. And Harriet threw herself into the work with the focused intensity that had always been her best quality and occasionally her most exhausting one. She organized her curriculum with military precision, ordered additional textbooks through the general store, and established a routine that gave the children structure and, she hoped, a sense that learning was a thing worth caring about. Monroe Dawson appeared on that first Friday, not to see her, or so it seemed, but to fix a hinge on the schoolhouse door that had been giving trouble. He worked quietly while she was still at her desk after the children had gone home, grading the day's reading exercises, and she was so absorbed in her work that she did not notice him until he said, from the doorway, that he had replaced the hardware and it ought to hold properly now. She looked up and felt that same small jolt she had felt the first time, the one she had been carefully not thinking about all week, and she thanked him and asked if he would like a cup of coffee, as she had a small pot keeping warm on the wood stove. He considered this for a moment, the way he seemed to consider most things, with a patience that felt rare in this part of the world, and then he said yes, if it was not any trouble, and he came in and sat down on one of the students' benches, which made him look enormous and slightly ridiculous, and she poured 2 cups and sat across from him, and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular. He asked her what had brought her to Caldwell, and she gave him the version she gave everyone, which was that she had heard there was a teaching position and she had the qualifications. He nodded at that and did not press, which she appreciated. She asked him what had brought him to Caldwell, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said he had been looking for a place to settle, and this one had seemed as good as any. It was not a very illuminating answer, and she noticed that he offered nothing more, but she did not press either, and they sat with that mutual restraint between them like a kind of agreement. He left when the light outside turned to deep gold, putting on his hat at the door and saying it had been a pleasure, Miss Reed. She said likewise, and watched the door close behind him, and sat for a long time with her empty coffee cup and the stack of papers she was supposed to be grading, thinking about the particular quality of his silences. After that he came by the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons, always with some pretext, a crooked nail here, a sticking window latch there, and gradually the pretexts became thinner and the coffee became expected, and the conversations became longer and more genuine and less cautious. She learned that he had grown up in Virginia, that he had come west after the war, that his father had been a carpenter and had taught him the trade, that he preferred working with his hands to sitting still, that he had read more than most people expected, that he had a dry humor that he deployed so quietly that it took her a moment to recognize it every time, and that he had a way of listening that made her feel that what she was saying genuinely mattered to him. She told him about her parents, about Missouri, about the fever. He listened without offering false comfort, without the hurried reassurances that most people gave because they did not know how to sit with someone else's grief. He just let her talk, and when she had said what she needed to say, he said he was sorry, and he meant it, and that was enough. She was aware, during all of this, that she was developing feelings that were considerably more significant than simple friendship. She was also aware that she knew relatively little about him in any concrete sense. He was generous and kind and clever in his quiet way, but there were edges of him she could not quite see, corners he kept turned away from the light, and she was a careful woman by nature, and she told herself that there was no hurry, that she should learn things slowly and surely, that this town was not going anywhere and neither was she. The cattle drives that came through in September filled the town with drovers and trail hands, and the saloons on Main Street ran loud until the small hours, and more than once Harriet heard the muffled sound of a dispute resolving itself in the street below her hotel room window. She came to understand quickly that Caldwell's proximity to the cattle trail meant that the law here was a complicated thing, that Sheriff Tom Aldridge did what he could with what he had, which was one deputy and a set of jailhouse bars that had been tested more than once, and that the town's safety was something that its residents took a certain practical interest in. Monroe, she learned, occasionally helped the sheriff in an unofficial capacity, not as a deputy, but as a man who had a certain calm authority in a crisis, and who knew how to talk to people who were worked up about something. She had seen him once step between two drovers who were arguing over a dice game outside the Silver Bell Saloon, and she had watched him talk both men down to something manageable with such unhurried, quiet confidence that she had been genuinely impressed. She had told him so, afterward, over coffee on a Friday, and he had looked slightly uncomfortable, the way he did when she praised him, and said it was nothing particular, just that most men did not actually want to fight when you gave them a reasonable way out of it. She had thought about that for a long time afterward. October came in cool and dry and brilliant, the prairie turning amber and rust, and Harriet was beginning to feel genuinely at home in Caldwell for the first time, beginning to feel the particular satisfaction of a life that was being built rather than simply endured. Her students were progressing. Several of the town's families had become warm acquaintances. Nora Tilley's at the Comstock house had taken a maternal interest in her, and Monroe Dawson was coming by on Friday afternoons and staying longer each week, and she had begun to allow herself to think, carefully and with deliberate restraint, that perhaps something real was happening between them. It was in late October that things began to shift in ways she did not entirely understand at the time. A man had come to town on a Monday, arriving on horseback from the south, and Harriet had noticed him only peripherally, as she noticed most things that were not directly related to her students or her work. He was a lean, hard-faced man named Curtis Boyle, who checked into the Silver Bell's back rooms rather than the Comstock house, which told you something about what kind of stay he intended. And he was in the company of two other men whose manner made the shopkeepers along Main Street stand slightly straighter and speak slightly more carefully. She heard about Curtis Boyle through Nora Tillys, who heard about everything. Nora told her that Curtis Boyle was a man with a history that followed him around like a bad smell, that he had worked the cattle trail and some jobs less legal than that, and that several people in town were watching him with the particular wariness that came from experience. What Nora did not tell her, what Harriet would not learn until much later, was that Curtis Boyle and Monroe Dawson had a shared history. The first indication Harriet had that something was wrong was on the Thursday after Boyle arrived, when Monroe did not come by on Friday afternoon. She sat with her coffee and her papers until the light left the sky, and then she told herself there were 100 reasons a person might not come by, and none of them were necessarily significant, and she went back to the Comstock house and tried to read, and did not manage it very well. He came by on Saturday morning instead, appearing at the schoolhouse door while she was rearranging her classroom bookshelves, and he looked tired in a way she had not seen in him before, the kind of tiredness that was not physical but something deeper, and there were shadows under his eyes and a tension in the set of his shoulders that she wanted very much to reach out and smooth away. He apologized for missing Friday. She said it was fine, because what else do you say? He said he had been dealing with something. She asked if he was all right. He said yes, and then was quiet for a moment, and she had the distinct impression that he was choosing what to say very carefully, that there were several things competing behind his eyes, and that whatever he chose to share was not the full picture. He asked if she would like to go for a walk, and she said yes, and they walked out along the edge of town toward the prairie, where the tall grass still held some of its autumn color, and the sky was that particular wide Kansas blue that seemed to go on forever in all directions. They walked for a while without saying very much, which was one of the things she valued about being with him, that the silence between them was comfortable rather than demanding, and then he stopped walking and stood looking out at the prairie with his hands in his pockets and said, "There are things about my past that I am not proud of, Harriet." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the horizon. She said that was true of most people. He said that was probably true, and then he was quiet again and she waited, but the rest of it did not come, and after a long moment he turned to look at her and the expression on his face was something complicated that she could not entirely read, something that wanted to say more and had decided not to, and she felt the first small cool thread of unease move through her. She said, "Monroe, if there is something you need to tell me, you can tell me." He looked at her for a long time and then he said, "I know, I will. Not yet, but I will." She accepted that because she did not have a better option and because she trusted him, or she wanted to, which was not quite the same thing. November arrived, and with it the first real cold, the kind that came sweeping down across the open plain with nothing to slow it, and settled into your bones if you let it. The cattle drives had mostly wound down for the season, which meant Caldwell grew quieter and more itself, the rougher edge of summer traffic wearing off and leaving the town that the permanent residents had built underneath. It was a town she had come to genuinely love, with its particular combination of raw ambition and hard practicality and the occasional surprising kindness. Monroe had been different since his Friday absence. Not cold, not distant, but somehow more careful with her, more deliberate, as though he was paying attention to everything about her with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly unnerving. He brought her a jar of the local honey that old Thomas Greer kept bees for, and a copy of a novel by George Eliot that he had ordered through the general store without telling her, and presented one Friday with the quiet formality of someone who had given the gesture considerable thought. She had looked at the book and then up at him, and she had felt so many things at once that she had had to look back down at the book to manage them. He had stayed for 3 hours that Friday, longer than usual, and they had talked about everything and nothing, her students and his work and the books they had both read and the way the light fell across the prairie at different hours of the day. And when he left, she had stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and watched him walk back down the road toward town, and she had known, with the clarity that sometimes arrives without any fanfare, that she was in love with this man. It was a knowledge that both settled and complicated everything, because she still had the sense of those corners she could not see, those parts of him that he kept carefully turned away, and she did not know what was in them, and she was not the kind of woman who could be comfortable not knowing. She told herself she would be patient. She told herself that trust was built slowly, and that was how it ought to be. She told herself a great many sensible things and believed most of them most of the time, and she threw herself into her work and her life in Caldwell, and let things develop at the pace they seemed to want to develop. It was Nora Tillies who told her. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but in the way that information sometimes escapes from a person who is trying to be careful with it, like water finding cracks in a vessel. They were sitting in the small parlor of the Comstock house on a Sunday evening in early November, drinking tea in the lamplight, and Nora was talking about the various characters who passed through town, as she often did, because Nora had a lifelong interest in human nature and no particular filter between her observations and her speech. And she said, almost offhandedly, that it was interesting that Monroe had ended up back in the same town as Curtis Boyle, given everything that had happened between them in Abilene. Harriet had set down her teacup very carefully and said, "Oh," and Nora, realizing she had said something that perhaps she ought not to have, had looked slightly uncomfortable and said that it was probably nothing she should repeat, and Harriet had said, "Nora, please," and something in her voice must have communicated the seriousness of her want to know, because Nora told her. What Nora told her was this: that 2 years ago in Abilene, Curtis Boyle had been running a scheme involving cattle that did not belong to him, and that Monroe Dawson had been, according to the accounts Nora had heard from various sources over the past several years, involved with Boyle's operation in some capacity, though the exact nature of that involvement was disputed depending on who was telling the story. Some said Monroe had been a willing participant. Some said he had been looking the other way in exchange for money. Some said he had tried to get out, and that was what had led to him ending up in Caldwell, that he had run from Abilene with something. Some said money, some said information, and that Boyle had come here to collect it. Harriet had sat very still through all of this. She had thanked Nora and gone upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a considerable amount of time, turning the information over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what lives underneath. She was not a woman given to dramatic conclusions. She knew that rumors in small towns were a living thing, growing and mutating with each telling, and that the truth of any given story was often considerably more complicated than any single version of it. But she also knew that Monroe had told her himself that there were things in his past he was not proud of, and she knew that his behavior in the past few weeks had the quality of a man managing something difficult, and she knew that Curtis Boyle was in this town, and she could not simply set all of those things aside and pretend they added up to nothing. She wanted to speak to Monroe directly. That was her instinct. That had always been her instinct. She was not someone who let things fester, and she was not someone who went to others to work out what she should simply ask the person directly. But she needed a day to manage her own feelings first, to get the hurt and the fear and the confusion sorted into something she could speak through clearly, because she was not going to go to him with a mess of emotion, and she was not going to let this conversation happen sideways. She took that day, And on the day after, she walked to the livery stable on the south end of Main Street and asked for Monroe Dawson. He came out from around the side of the stable wiping sawdust from his hands with a cloth, and when he saw her face he went still in the way that people go still when they recognize something they have been dreading. He said her name once quietly. She said she needed to speak with him. He said yes. She said not here, somewhere quieter, and he nodded and they walked out behind the stable to where there was a fence line and a view of the plain that spread flat and brown under the November sky. She told him what she had heard. She told him plainly, without embellishment, laying out what Nora had said as simply as she could. She watched his face while she spoke and watched the things that moved across it, none of which were the things a guilty man wears when he is caught, but something more complicated and more pained than that. When she was finished, she said, "I want the truth, Monroe, all of it. I will give you one chance to explain yourself." He looked at her for a long moment and then he said, "I will need the whole evening." And she stayed. They walked back to the schoolhouse, because it was the place that felt most like neutral ground to both of them, the place where she felt strongest and where she had come to think of him as most himself. And she unlocked the door and they went inside, and she built up the fire in the wood stove and they sat, not at the students' benches this time, but in the two chairs she kept near the stove for when she had parent visits, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at him and waited. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hat on the floor beside him, and he looked at the fire for a while before he spoke. And when he spoke slowly, with the particular cadence of a man who has rehearsed what he wants to say, but is finding that the rehearsal does not quite fit the reality of the moment. He told her the truth. He said that 5 years ago he had come west from Virginia with nothing but his carpentry skills and the need to be somewhere new, somewhere that had no memory of the war and what it had cost him, and he had worked his way through Kentucky and Missouri and eventually Kansas, taking whatever work was available. He had ended up in Abilene in 1874, which was still very much a cattle town in those years, loud and profitable and loose around the edges, and he had found work doing repairs and construction, and he had been doing well enough. He had met Curtis Boyle at a card game. He said that carefully, laying the circumstance out clearly, because he knew how it might sound and he wanted to be fair to his own past rather than flattering it. Boyle was charismatic, in that particular way that certain dangerous men are, and he had seemed at the time like simply a business-minded man with a lot of energy and a talent for making opportunities appear. He had offered Monroe a job, not as a carpenter, but as someone who could help him manage some cattle transfers that he said were part of a larger ranching operation in Texas. Monroe had done 2 of those transfers before he understood what he was actually involved in. He said that plainly and without excuse, looking at her steadily, because he knew that not asking enough questions was itself a kind of choice. By the 3rd transfer he had understood that the cattle were stolen, taken from ranchers along the trail, brands altered, paperwork forged, and by then he was in deep enough that simply walking away was complicated, because Boyle was not the kind of man who accepted departure lightly. He had gone to the sheriff in Abilene, he said. That was the part that Nora's version had not included or had not known. He had gone to the sheriff quietly in the autumn of 1875, and he had told him what he knew and given him the information that was necessary to bring Boyle's operation down. The sheriff had moved on Boyle, and 2 of his men had been arrested and sent to trial and convicted. But the case had been messy, as these things often were, and Monroe had given his testimony and then been advised by the lawman who had worked the case that it would be safer for him to leave Abilene, because Boyle had friends who had not been caught, and friends had a way of holding grudges on behalf of the men who could not hold their own. So he had left Abilene. He had come south to Caldwell, which was growing fast and needed craftsmen, and he had put down what roots he could put down and tried to become someone worth being. He paused there and looked at her. She asked why Boyle was here now, in Caldwell. Monroe said that Boyle had apparently served 2 years of his sentence and been released in the spring of 1878, and that he had come to Caldwell because he believed Monroe had taken money from the operation before going to the sheriff. He said that was not true, that he had taken nothing, that the money Boyle thought was missing had likely been taken by one of Boyle's own men who had fled before the sheriff arrived, but that there was no way to prove that to Boyle, and Boyle had decided to believe the version that gave him someone to be angry at. She asked why he had not told her any of this when the subject had first come up, when he had said he had things in his past he was not proud of. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he was afraid, not of Boyle, though he was managing that separately, but afraid of what she would think of him. He said he had come to care for her in a way that was different from anything he had allowed himself to care for in a very long time, that she was someone he respected deeply and did not want to lose the respect of, and he had told himself he would find the right time, the right way to tell her, and that in the meantime he was trying to manage the situation with Boyle quietly before it could touch her or anything she cared about. She listened to all of this with the stillness that she had trained into herself over the past 2 days, the careful managed stillness of a woman who knew that she could not respond to any of this well if she responded to it immediately. The fire crackled in the stove, and outside the wind moved through the grass, and the darkness of a Kansas November night pressed against the schoolhouse windows, and she sat with everything he had told her and let it settle. She asked him several questions. She asked whether the sheriff in Abilene could verify his account. He said yes, he had kept the name of the lawman he had worked with, and he had a letter among his papers that could be sent for if necessary. She asked what he intended to do about Boyle now. He said he had already spoken with Sheriff Aldridge here in Caldwell, who was aware of the situation and was watching Boyle's movements. He said he was not going to run again. He said running had been the right choice in Abilene, but it was not the right choice here, and he was not going to let Boyle follow him across the map forever. She asked him, finally, looking at him directly in the firelight, why he had not simply trusted her. He met her gaze and said, "Because trusting someone completely is the most frightening thing I know how to do, and I have never been particularly brave about that particular kind of fear." That was honest enough that it hurt a little, the way honest things sometimes do when they touch something true in you as well. And Harriet sat with that for a moment, and recognized that she was not entirely without sympathy for the feeling, that she had spent a good portion of her own life managing her feelings into carefully organized containers rather than letting them move freely through her, and that she had come to Caldwell partly because it was easier to go somewhere new than to stay somewhere that held too much. She did not forgive him that evening in the sense of declaring it resolved and closed. What she did was something more practical and more real than that. She told him that she understood the facts of his past better now, and that those facts, while they gave her pause, did not make her think less of who he was today, but that what did give her pause was that he had chosen silence over honesty with her for weeks, and that if there was to be anything real between them going forward, she needed him to understand that she could not accept that kind of silence again. She needed to be someone he could tell things to, even the difficult things, especially the difficult things. He said he understood that. She said she was not finished. She said she was aware that she had her own faults in this direction, that she had built her own walls and maintained her own careful distances, and that perhaps what she was really asking was not just for him to be honest with her, but for them both to commit to the harder, more vulnerable work of being genuinely known to each other. And that if he was willing to do that, truly willing, then she was willing to give them a real chance. He looked at her across the small space between the 2 chairs, in the firelight, with the wind outside and the darkness and the particular silence of a November night in Kansas, and he said yes. He said it simply and without any of the defensive qualifications that lesser men would have offered, and she believed him. They sat by the fire for a long while after that, talking with a kind of openness that was new between them, the specific quality of openness that comes after a hard truth has been said and received and survived. She told him things she had not told him before, about her grief for her parents, about how the neatness of her classroom was partly compensation for the chaos of loss, about how frightened she had been on the stage into Caldwell that first day, even though she had not let it show. He told her about Virginia, about what the war years had been, about his brother who had not come home from it, about how it had taken him years to learn how to stay in one place and mean it. By the time the fire had burned down to coals and they had talked themselves somewhere close to the center of things, it was past 9 o'clock and the night was full and quiet, and Harriet felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the particular feeling of being thoroughly known and not alone. He walked her back to the Comstock house through the cold night air, and at the door he took her hand and held it for a moment and asked if she would take a proper supper with him on Saturday at the hotel's dining room. She said she would. He said good night, and she said good night, and she went inside and stood in the warm entrance hall of the Comstock house with her heart doing something undignified in her chest and a smile on her face that she made no effort to contain. The week that followed was occupied on multiple fronts simultaneously. Curtis Boyle made his move on Wednesday. He had come to the livery stable where Monroe worked and made it clear, loudly enough that 2 other men heard it, that he intended to have back what he believed Monroe owed him, and he had made the kind of implications about physical consequences that Sheriff Aldridge took seriously enough to come speak with Monroe that same afternoon. Monroe, for his part, had been calm. He had sent a telegram to Abilene, to the lawman who had worked the case, a man named Deputy Leonard Hatch, now apparently a marshal, and received a reply within 2 days confirming Monroe's account of events and offering to send written documentation if needed. Harriet knew all of this because Monroe told her. He told her on Thursday evening, coming to find her at the schoolhouse after her students had gone, sitting down in one of the student benches with his long legs crowded under the desk, and telling her what had happened with the careful directness of a man keeping a promise. And she sat across from him and listened and asked her questions, and he answered them. And it felt different between them now, more solid, more real, the way ground feels after rain has settled the dust. She asked if he was worried. He said, honestly, that he was more angry than worried, which she accepted as a fair distinction. The situation with Boyle resolved itself by Friday, not dramatically but practically, as most things in a well-administered town eventually did. Sheriff Aldridge, who was more capable than Caldwell's rough exterior might have suggested, had been building a case for several days, and with the telegram from Marshal Hatch in hand, along with the testimony of the 2 men who had witnessed Boyle's threats, he had enough to arrest Curtis Boyle on charges of threatening behavior and to hold him pending a hearing. Boyle's 2 companions, lacking the nerve to do anything without their leader giving the order, had ridden out of town before sunup on Friday morning and had not come back. Monroe told her this over supper on Saturday evening, at the hotel dining room, sitting across from her at a white-clothed table with a candle between them, and the relief in his face when he described it was genuine and uncomplicated. The relief of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally been able to put it down. She told him she was glad. He said, and then paused, and then said he was glad too, but the specific gladness he felt at the moment was about being here in this room at this table with her. And he said it without his usual careful qualifier, without the slight holding back that had always been there before, and it was different enough that she noticed it, and it made something warm move through the center of her chest. She said, Monroe, if you are trying to say something, you might as well say it properly. He picked up his coffee cup and then set it down without drinking from it and said, I believe I am in love with you, Harriet Reed. She looked at him across the candle. She said, I believe I am in love with you too, Monroe Dawson, and I have been for some time. And I expect it is past time we both admitted it. He smiled then, the full version of it, the one she had been cataloging since the very first day in the schoolhouse doorway, and it was even better than she remembered, and she thought that she could probably spend a significant portion of her life looking at that smile and not find it anything less than remarkable. December came in hard and bright, with cold that cracked the air like a shot and sent the citizens of Caldwell indoors around their stoves and lamps. The schoolhouse was warm with the fire burning, and the energy of 14 children who had discovered that their teacher was considerably more interesting than they had initially supposed. And Harriet was deep in a lesson on American geography when the door opened and Monroe came in stamping snow from his boots, and 14 pairs of eyes swiveled toward him with the undivided attention that adults never quite manage to give. He apologized for the interruption with the slightly abashed quality of a man who had not quite accounted for the audience, and asked if she might have a moment after the children were released, and she said yes, and he went back out into the cold, and 14 pairs of eyes swiveled back to her with an entirely different kind of interest than they had applied to American geography. When the children had gone that afternoon, she found him waiting outside, leaning against the schoolhouse wall in his coat with his hands in his pockets, and he said he had spoken with Nora Tillies about the room situation at the Comstock house, and that Nora had mentioned there was a property on the north edge of town that had become available, and he had been looking at it, and he thought it had promise, and he wanted to know what she thought of it. She asked what she had to do with a property on the north edge of town. He said, well, that depended somewhat on whether she had any objection to the idea of him asking her to marry him, because he was considering doing that, and it seemed relevant to the question of the property. She stared at him. He looked back at her with that calm steadiness that she had come to know was not indifference, but rather the particular kind of stillness that very genuine emotion produces in people who feel things deeply and do not know what to do with their hands. She said he had better ask her properly then. He took off his hat, which was cold enough that she appreciated the gesture significantly, and he said, Harriet Reed, I would like very much to spend the rest of my life with you, if you will have me, and I understand that is a question that deserves a great deal more than a discussion on the side of a building in December, and I intend to do this properly with dinner and a ring when I have managed to locate one. But I find I cannot wait any longer to ask you because I have been sitting on the feeling for too long already, and it does not improve with further sitting. She laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a suppressed laugh, but a genuine one, full and warm, and it made something complicated and relieved move across his face. And she said yes, Monroe, obviously yes, and he put his hat back on and took her hands and held them, both of them cold through their gloves, and they stood in the December wind outside the schoolhouse on the north end of Caldwell, Kansas, and looked at each other with the particular look of two people who have chosen each other properly and mean it entirely. The ring came from the general store's small glass case, a simple gold band with a small setting that was not as fine as something from a city jeweler but was clean and good and suited her. And he gave it to her at dinner at the Comstock house, with Nora Tillies beaming from behind the kitchen door, in a way that suggested she was not quite as discreet as she believed herself to be. Harriet put it on, and it fit as though it had been made for her, and she looked at it on her finger across the table, and then looked at Monroe, and neither of them said anything for a moment because what was there to say when everything was already said? They were married in January of 1879, on a Saturday, in the church that also served as the town meeting hall, with the whole of Caldwell's permanent population in attendance, because in a small town a wedding is a thing the whole community takes ownership of. The minister was a serious man named Reverend Carver, who had come out from Ohio with the frontier spirit of the church-building movement of those years, and who gave them a service that was dignified and warm in equal measure. Harriet wore her best dress, dark blue wool with white collar, and Monroe wore a suit that he had clearly cleaned and pressed to within an inch of its life, and they stood before Reverend Carver and the assembled town, and made their promises in voices that did not waver, And when it was done and Monroe kissed her in front of everyone, the room broke into the kind of noise that only people genuinely pleased about something can produce. Nora Tilly's cried. She said afterward that she never cried at weddings, but it was clearly not true. The property Monroe had found on the north edge of town was a house that needed significant work, which suited them both. He spent the winter months rebuilding the interior with the focused pleasure of a craftsman working on something that mattered to him personally, and she spent those same months keeping his coffee hot and reading to him in the evenings, and making the schoolhouse into something that the families of Caldwell could be genuinely proud of. They built their life together the way good things are built, without hurry and without false expectations, one solid piece at a time. He was a good husband. That was not a small thing, and she knew it was not a small thing. He was present and honest and useful and funny in his quiet way, and he had kept his promise to her about telling her difficult things, learning gradually and sometimes imperfectly, but always genuinely to bring her into the parts of his life that were complicated as well as the parts that were easy. And she, in turn, had kept her own promise, working steadily on the particular discipline of letting herself be truly known, letting her careful walls come down one plank at a time in the warmth of a life that was becoming more itself every day. Spring came to Caldwell in March of 1879, with the extravagant relief that spring always has in places that have endured a hard winter, and the prairie beyond their North Edge house turned green in what seemed like days. And Harriet stood at the kitchen window one morning with her tea and looked at the greening plain and the enormous sky, and felt a contentment so complete that it surprised her with its weight. Monroe came up behind her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, and looked out the window too, and she leaned back against him, and they stood like that for a moment, watching the Kansas morning arrive. And he said quietly that he was glad he had asked for the whole evening. She said she was glad she had stayed. He pressed his lips to her temple, and she closed her eyes and thought that this was the kind of thing that deserved to be remembered, not because it was dramatic or unusual, but because it was precisely the opposite of those things, because it was just two people standing at a window on an ordinary spring morning in a life they had chosen and built together, and that was everything. By summer, Harriet discovered she was expecting a child. She told Monroe at supper on a June evening, watching his face when she said it, watching the journey it made from comprehension to wonder, and he set down his fork and looked at her with such transparent, unguarded happiness that she felt her throat tighten. He said, "Are you certain?" She said yes. She was quite certain. He stood up from the table and came to her side of it and took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was, for a man with a carpenter's hands, remarkable, and he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "Harriet, you are the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to me." And she laughed and blinked fast and said that was very kind of him, but he was going to make her cry, and she did not want to cry at supper. He said crying at supper seemed reasonable in the circumstances. She said it did not seem very dignified. He said dignity was overrated. She laughed again and took his hands and held them, and they sat there together in the June evening, while the sound of Caldwell going about its summer business came through the open window. And she thought about all of the distances she had traveled to reach this kitchen and this man and this particular moment. And she found that all of it, the grief and the fear and the hard, cold stage, ride into an unknown town, and the week of managed silence before the evening in the schoolhouse. All of it seemed to her not like obstacles to happiness, but like the path to it, like the specific route that had been required to arrive here. Their son was born in February of 1880, in the house on the north edge of town, with the assistance of Mrs. Carver, the Reverend's wife, who had become the nearest thing to a midwife that Caldwell possessed. He was a healthy, loud, extremely opinionated child from his first moments, with his father's dark hair and his mother's precise brown eyes, and they named him Thomas James Dawson, Thomas for Monroe's father and James for Harriet's. Monroe sat beside her bed for 2 hours after Thomas was born, holding the baby with the concentrated care of a man who understood that he was holding something irreplaceable. And he barely spoke, but his face said everything that needed saying. Harriet watched him with the particular exhaustion that follows childbirth, which is the kind of exhaustion that feels earned rather than depleting. And she thought that she had never in her life seen anything more purely good than Monroe Dawson holding his son in the lamplight of their bedroom, while the Kansas winter pressed cold against the windows outside. Thomas grew fast and with enormous enthusiasm for everything he encountered, which kept his parents occupied and occasionally breathless throughout the spring and summer of 1880. Monroe built a cradle that was a masterpiece of practical carpentry, smooth and solid and built to last decades, and then built a small rocking chair beside it for Harriet, and then built a proper rocking chair for himself for the front porch. And Harriet watched all of this construction with the fond amusement of someone who understood that he worked with wood the way she worked with words, as a way of putting the things he felt into something he could shape and leave behind. Caldwell continued to grow through those years. The cattle drives came and went. The town got a second school when the population warranted it, and Harriet trained her replacement for the original schoolhouse and moved to the larger one on the east side of town, where she taught until 1882 when she decided to step back for a time, partly because Thomas was a handful and partly because another baby was coming. The second child was also a boy, born in the spring of 1882 and named William Robert Dawson, William for Monroe's older brother who had survived the war and was living in Ohio, and Robert for a very good reason that they told several versions of depending on who was asking. William was entirely different from Thomas, quieter and more observant from the beginning, watching the world with a deliberation that reminded Harriet so thoroughly of his father that it made her smile every time she looked at him. Monroe, by the spring of 1882, had built a carpentry business that employed 2 other men and supplied a good portion of Caldwell's furniture and construction work, and was well enough regarded in the community that he had been approached twice about running for town council, a prospect he viewed with the horrified resistance of a man who had a deep commitment to helping the community and a profound desire not to do so by attending meetings. He eventually, largely through Harriet's patient and unenthusiastic encouragement, agreed to take a seat on the council in 1883, and proved to be exactly as good at it as she had suspected he would be and exactly as quietly unhappy about the meeting attending as he had predicted. He told her one evening, after returning from a particularly lengthy council meeting about the proposed expansion of the main street, that he did not know how she managed a room full of children every day without losing her composure. She told him that children, unlike council members, were honest about what they wanted. He considered this and said it was a fair point. Life in Caldwell through the early 1880s had its difficulties, as life in any frontier town did. The Cherokee Strip to the south was a constant source of political and legal complexity, and the injustices that the federal government had conducted toward the tribal nations who had been removed and relocated, and had their agreements rewritten around them were visible and present, and something that the more thoughtful residents of Caldwell were aware of, even if the larger machinery of policy was beyond any individual's power to stop. Monroe had a number of conversations with Harriet about this, about the land they were living on and the history of how it had come to be available for settlement, and she brought some of those conversations into her classroom in the ways that a good teacher does, carefully and honestly, giving her students the most truthful picture she could of the world they were growing up in rather than the flattened and simplified version that it was easier to offer. She had a student in 1881, a girl of 10 named Clara Harjo, daughter of a man who had come north from the territory to work in Caldwell's growing economy, and Clara was one of the sharpest students Harriet had ever taught, quick with mathematics and voracious about reading, and Harriet had made sure she had access to every resource the school could offer. When Clara's family moved back south the following year, Harriet had sent her with a full set of books and a letter of recommendation to every teacher and schoolmaster she could identify in the territory, because she believed that a child like that deserved every possible door to be held open. Monroe had asked her once, watching her write the letters, what she thought she was accomplishing. She had said she did not know exactly what she was accomplishing, but she knew what she was not accomplishing if she did nothing, and that seemed like sufficient reason to act. He had smiled at her with the particular quality of admiration that she had never entirely gotten used to receiving from him, and said she was the most sensible person he had ever met. She had said that was a low bar in this part of the world. He had said it was not, and he had meant it, and she had felt it. Thomas, at 2 years old, had developed a habit of following his father around the carpentry workshop, with the intense investigative interest of someone who believed that everything in the world had a practical function that he personally needed to understand. Monroe bore this with remarkable patience, answering the questions as they came, explaining the tools and the wood and the reasons behind each step of whatever he was working on, and Harriet would sometimes stand in the workshop doorway watching the two of them, her husband crouched down to Thomas's level with some piece of wood and a careful explanation, and think that this was what a life was. This specific particular accumulation of ordinary moments that were not ordinary at all if you paid them the attention they deserved. In the fall of 1883, a dry summer had made things harder for many of the ranchers surrounding Caldwell, and the town felt the economic tightening that naturally followed. Monroe's carpentry business took on more repair work and less new construction, and Harriet returned to teaching full-time, which she was glad to do, and they managed carefully and without real fear because they had built something solid, and solid things tend to hold through hard times. It was during that autumn that Monroe came home one evening and told her something she had not expected. He had received a letter from his brother William in Ohio, who was asking whether Monroe had any interest in going into a larger building venture together, a construction company in a growing town in the Ohio River Valley, with the capital coming from William and the skills coming from Monroe. He laid out the letter and the proposal across the kitchen table and sat across from her and told her all of it without guiding her toward any particular response, and she read the letter twice and then looked at him. She asked what he wanted to do. He said he wanted to know what she wanted before he decided what he wanted. She said that was not a very satisfying answer. He said he knew, and he said it with a small smile, and then he said honestly that he had been in Caldwell for 5 years and he had come to love it, but that what he loved most in the world was sitting across this table from her, and he would be content wherever that table was located. He said that if she wanted to stay, they would stay, because she had built something genuine and meaningful here, and he was not going to ask her to uproot that for his own interests. But if she was open to a different place, a different kind of life, he thought William's proposal had genuine merit. She thought about it for several days. She thought about the schoolhouse and her students and Nora Tilley's and the particular wide beauty of the Kansas plain. She thought about Thomas and William, who were Caldwell children and knew every inch of this town. She thought about what a life was for and what it was made of and what she actually needed to live it well. She told him that the table was the thing that mattered, that she agreed with him about that, and that if he wanted to write to William and explore the proposal further, she was willing to go where the work and their life together required them to go. They did not end up taking William's offer, in the end, because Monroe looked carefully at the numbers and the terms and concluded that the venture carried more risk than William's optimism suggested, and that taking on that risk with 2 small children was not something he was willing to do. He wrote to William with a clear explanation of his reasoning, which William received with some frustration but ultimately understood, and they continued their correspondence across the years, with the warmth that sometimes survives the minor disappointments of family. What Monroe did instead was expand his Caldwell business, taking on a third employee in 1884 and securing a contract to build several of the new commercial buildings that went up along the expanded Main Street as the town continued to grow. It was good work, and he was good at it, and the business grew steadily through the middle years of the decade. Harriet had a third child in 1885, and this one was a girl, and they named her Clara, partly because of the sharp, clever student she had sent south with books and letters, and partly because they both liked the name, and it suited the small, bright-eyed creature who arrived in their house that March, and proceeded to make her opinions known from approximately the first hour. Monroe held Clara with the same focused tenderness he had brought to all of his children, and he looked up at Harriet over the baby's head and said, "She already looks like she has very specific ideas about things." Harriet said that sounded familiar. He laughed and she laughed, and Clara made a sound that was not quite either of those things, but was in the general direction of comment. Thomas, at 5, was deeply uncertain about his sister and spent the first several weeks observing her from a careful distance, the way he approached everything new, with the systematic wariness of a scientific investigator. William, at 3, had no such hesitation and immediately attempted to share all of his toys with her simultaneously, which created logistical challenges. Monroe managed both of them with the patient humor that Harriet had come to regard as one of his most essential qualities. The late 1880s in Caldwell were years of change, as they were across the western frontier. The open range was closing. The railroads were going everywhere. The wildness that had defined these towns was not disappearing, but was being organized and contained and redirected, and the people who had come out here for the freedom of open space were finding that freedom, as it always does, coming with an increasing set of terms and conditions. Monroe talked about this sometimes in the evenings, about how the West he had come to was different from the West that existed now, and whether that was loss or growth or simply the irreversible nature of time. Harriet told him she thought it was all three simultaneously, and that the frontier had always been both the best and worst version of American ambition at once, that the same forces that had built something real and vital out here had also done things that deserved to be honestly accounted for, and that the best thing they could do was make the town they lived in as good as it could be, raise children who understood the difference between justice and convenience, and leave things better than they had found them. He looked at her across the supper table, Thomas and William engaged in some dispute over a wooden horse on the floor beside the stove, Clara asleep upstairs, and he said that he was very glad she had stayed that evening in the schoolhouse. She said she was very glad he had had enough to say to fill the whole evening. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned hers over and held his back, and Thomas and William's dispute resolved itself in a minor miracle of sibling diplomacy, and outside the Kansas evening went dark and warm, and the lamp on the table between them cast a light that was enough for everything. By 1888, the Dawson household was a lively and in some moments overwhelming place. Thomas was 8 and had inherited his father's talent with his hands and his mother's tenacity, and spent most of his time either in the carpentry workshop or conducting various building projects in the yard that had resulted in what he called a fort, and everyone else called a structure of ongoing interest. William was 6 and had turned into precisely the quiet, deliberate child he had promised to be, reading everything he could lay his hands on, carrying books around the house and the yard, and to supper, requiring only gentle reminders that books and soup were not entirely compatible at the same table. Clara was 3 and in full possession of the particular confidence that third children often develop, moving through the household with the certainty of someone who has watched how things work and concluded that she can improve upon the current system. Monroe had begun, around this time, to teach Thomas the basics of carpentry with the same patience his own father had brought to teaching him. And Harriet sometimes came to the workshop door in the late afternoon and stood watching the two of them at the workbench, Monroe's voice quiet and explaining, Thomas's face set with concentration, and she felt the specific and complicated emotion of seeing something good perpetuate itself across a generation. She taught Clara her letters at the kitchen table before Clara was old enough for school, because Clara made it clear she wanted to know, and Harriet was not in the habit of making people wait for knowledge they actively wanted. By the time Clara arrived at the schoolhouse as a proper student, she could already read at a level that startled her young teacher, who sent a note home saying that Clara was an exceptional child, and Monroe and Harriet exchanged a look over that note that contained an entire conversation. There had been a day in 1887, late summer, when Monroe had come home from the workshop looking different, quieter than usual, carrying something in his face that she recognized from the early days of their marriage, that weight that he sometimes carried when something difficult was present in him. She had asked him what was wrong over supper, after the children were in bed, and he had sat for a moment, and then said that he had heard from a contact in Abilene that Curtis Boyle had died in prison the previous year, had been there serving time for a subsequent offense after his Caldwell arrest, and that the thing he felt about that was not as simple as he thought it would be. She had asked him what he did feel. He said he felt something that was not quite grief, but was adjacent to it, the particular feeling of a chapter that is conclusively closed. He said Boyle had been the shadow he had carried from Abilene, and now that shadow was gone, and he did not quite know what to do with the absence of it. He said he supposed it had been part of his interior landscape for so long that losing it, even losing something bad, felt strange. She said she understood that. She said grief was like that sometimes, that you could grieve the end of a difficulty as well as the end of a good thing, because both were endings and endings deserved to be acknowledged. He said that was a very generous way to look at it. She said she was a very generous woman. He smiled, and she saw the weight in his face ease, and she reached across and put her hand over his, and they sat together in the quiet kitchen while the children slept upstairs and the Kansas night settled around their house. In 1889, the land rush opened the unassigned lands in Indian Territory to settlement, and the world changed overnight for the region, and Caldwell, which had been a border town in more than one sense for its entire existence, felt the shift in its foundations. Thousands of people moved through the area heading south to stake their claims, and the town was busy and chaotic for months, and Harriet watched it all from her schoolhouse window and thought about the people who had been on that land before the rush, about the ongoing cost of the frontier's opening, and she brought those thoughts carefully and honestly into her teaching, the way she always had. Monroe's carpentry business did well during the rush and the settlement that followed, as new construction went up everywhere and craftsmen were in demand, and by 1890 they were comfortable enough to put a real addition on the North Edge house, which had been getting crowded, and Monroe built it himself over the summer with Thomas, now 10, working as his capable assistant, and it was the best summer either of them had in memory. And Harriet watched them from the kitchen window and felt the same feeling she had been feeling for 11 years now without it diminishing in the slightest. She was 38 years old in 1890. Monroe was 43. Thomas was 10, William was 8, Clara was 5. The house was warm and full. The schoolhouse on the east side of town was thriving. The carpentry business was sound. The marriage was as real and solid as anything she had ever known, built on the foundation of that long evening in the schoolhouse when she had stayed and listened and chosen to trust, and when he had told the truth and trusted her with it, and when they had both decided that the harder and more frightening work of genuine honesty was the only work worth doing together. She thought sometimes about all of the roads that had led her here, the fever in Missouri and the empty house, and the letter about a teaching position, and a stage ride south into an unknown place, and a man standing in a doorway with sawdust in his hair and quiet eyes. She thought about the weeks of cautious Friday coffees and the walks and the conversations, and the first awareness of love that she had been so careful with. She thought about Nora Tilley's parlor and the cold thread of unease and the 2 days of managed feelings and the main street in the autumn of 1878 and the words she had said, one chance, and his answer. She thought about staying. It had been the right thing, the only thing, and she would have made that same choice 100 times over. Monroe came inside from the workshop one autumn evening in 1890, Thomas trailing after him with the serious demeanor of a boy who has been doing real work and knows it, both of them with sawdust in their hair and the particular satisfaction on their faces that comes from building something well. And Monroe came to where she was standing at the stove and put his arms around her from behind and stood there for a moment with his chin on her shoulder, looking at the pot she was stirring, and he said, "What would you think about another one?" She turned to look at him over her shoulder. He said he had been thinking about it and was aware it was her decision more than his, and he did not want to press, but he had been thinking about it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had chosen and who had chosen her, this carpenter with his careful hands and his quiet manner and his dark eyes that had never once stopped seeing her clearly even on the days when she would have preferred to be invisible. And she said, "Monroe Dawson, you had better not be suggesting that to a woman standing at a hot stove." He laughed and she turned back to the stove smiling, and Thomas made a face of profound theatrical disgust and retreated back outside with the dignity appropriate to a boy of 10 who has witnessed his parents being affectionate. And Monroe stayed where he was with his arms around her and his chin on her shoulder, and the kitchen warm and full of the smell of supper, and the sound of children in various parts of the house. And Harriet thought about what he had said, and she thought it was not a bad idea. And she thought that was exactly the kind of thought that meant a life was genuinely abundant. Their 4th child arrived in the summer of 1891, another boy, whom they named Henry after no one in particular, except that it was a name that suited him. And Henry came into the world with the specific placid good nature that sometimes follows years of energetic precedence, as though he had observed from whatever place babies observe from before they arrive that this household already had sufficient intensity represented, and he would balance it. He was a sunny, undemanding baby who slept when he was supposed to and ate when he was supposed to, and looked at everything with large, interested eyes. And Clara took immediate ownership of him in the way of 5-year-olds who have been the youngest for too long, and are delighted to have someone smaller to organize. Monroe held Henry the first night and looked across at Harriet with the same look he had given her over Thomas and William and Clara, that transparent, unguarded happiness that had never once felt routine to her. And she thought, as she had thought each time, that this was a man who knew how to love, who had learned it the hard and honest way, and who gave it completely when he gave it, and she was the most fortunate person she knew. The years stretched forward and the Dawson family grew into them. Thomas eventually joined the carpentry business, which Monroe had quietly been preparing for without ever pressuring him toward it, because he wanted his son to choose his own work, and knew that if he was patient the choice would come naturally. And it did, in Thomas's 16th year, when he told his father over supper that he wanted to learn the trade properly, and Monroe looked at him with more happiness than he showed in most circumstances, and said he had been hoping Thomas would say that. William took himself to college in 1896, a thing that had not been available in Caldwell but was available in Topeka, and he went with a trunk full of books and a ferocious determination to study law, which was exactly the profession anyone who had ever watched him read through supper could have predicted. Harriet sent him off at the stage with the kind of pride that physically hurts in the best possible way, and Monroe stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they watched the stage go until it was gone. And then he said, "He is going to be exceptional," and she said, "I know," and they walked home together through the Caldwell morning. Clara grew up to be exactly what her early years had promised, sharp and clear-eyed and possessed of strong opinions about everything. And she became, in her own time, a teacher, which surprised no one who knew her mother, and which Harriet received with a pride that was perhaps slightly different from how she received her son's achievements, because it carried a specific continuity she had not expected to feel. Henry, the youngest, quiet and sunny like his beginnings, developed a talent for music, which was somewhat baffling to everyone in the family given that neither Monroe nor Harriet could carry a tune with any conviction, but which they supported fully by acquiring a second-hand piano that Monroe repaired and restored until it played beautifully, and which became the center of many evenings in the Dawson house for years to come. Monroe turned 50 in 1896, and Harriet organized a gathering at their house that included every person they had come to know and love in Caldwell over the 18 years they had been there, which turned out to be a considerable number of people, because Monroe had a way of inspiring genuine loyalty in people, even when he was not trying to. And Harriet had built, through her years of teaching, a kind of relationship with the town that made her its own particular kind of institution. Nora Tillies came, now in her late 60s and somewhat more fragile than she had once been, but still with the same all-seeing eyes and the same enthusiasm for the important events of everyone she knew. And she sat next to Harriet at one point during the evening and said, "I always knew he was a good one about Monroe." And Harriet said, "Nora, you told me things about him that nearly sent me away," and Nora said, "And yet you stayed," and looked at her with that particular expression of someone who has always understood more than they let on. Harriet looked across the room at Monroe, who was standing near the back porch with Thomas and two of the other men he had worked with for years, laughing at something, his dark hair now well threaded with gray and his face carrying all the lines of a life well and fully lived. And she said, "Yes, I stayed." And she meant everything in those two words, all of it, from that first autumn evening in the schoolhouse to this moment in the warm lamplight of the house he had built for them. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Monroe caught her looking, and his face changed the way it had always changed when he looked at her. That shift in the geography of it that she had been cataloging since 1878 and still found remarkable. And he said something to the men beside him and excused himself, and came across the room to where she was sitting and sat down beside her, and took her hand without saying anything. And she held his hand and looked at the room full of their life. Their friends and their children and their life's work represented in every corner. And she thought about the girl on the stage from Missouri who had been going somewhere new because there was nothing left behind her. And she thought about everything that had been built since then. She said quietly, not to anyone in particular, "I am so glad I stayed." And Monroe pressed her hand in his and said, "So am I, Harriet. So am I." Outside, the Caldwell night was enormous and full of stars, the way it had always been out here on the plain where there was nothing between you and the sky. And the wind moved through the tall grass beyond the fence line, and the sounds of the party came warm through the lit windows of the house. And somewhere inside Henry was playing the piano and someone was laughing, and everything was exactly as it should be, completely and fully and finally resolved into something that could only be called a life. Generous and real, and built on the foundation of one long honest evening and the decision to stay.